Welcome to the second lecture on the medical museum, and we're going to pick up with thinking about pathological displays in particular. The whole idea of collecting pathology, or collecting the monstrous as it was called in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, or the thing that was different, that is unusual, that was curious. It is really something which motivated some of these collectors who gave us our medical museums. And Frederick Reusch is a great example of how the aesthetic, the artistic, the creative went together with the medical, and how the monstrous or the curious, what we would now call disability in a lot of cases, went together with this desire to look, the desire to exhibit, the desire to collect, to catalogue. So here's one of these tableaux that Frederick Reusch would make. So these are fetuses that you can see here, which have been preserved and mounted and put together with various bits of natural materials, some bits of seaweed, botany of various kinds, rocks and shells and other bits and bobs, I guess you could say, from the natural world that were placed together and mounted and put into these, and were really ornate. And sometimes this kind of black humor comes through these displays, and they were shared and part of his very extensive curiosity cabinet. And then there are, and I'm just showing you a few examples of what I'm talking about when I say pathological exhibits in these museums. This would be, this is a wax model. Again, this one's from Bologna. But instead of it being, the wax anatomical Venus, the beautiful woman that we saw in the previous lecture, we have these conjoined twins. And then we would have these kinds of replicas of slices of brain, and these brains would be from people who suffered from various illnesses. And then there were other kinds of things that were collected and classified as pathological specimens. And in this case, these are skin samples taken from Italian criminals, and these pieces of skin that were preserved had tattoos, as you can see here, and this was used to understand the mentality of the criminal through this collection of tattoos. And then this one, which is at UCL in London, is just giving you various samples of brains that have been taken from various creatures. So this gives you a sense of how there's a comparative aspect to pathology. So not just comparing normal and abnormal, but comparing animal and human and various animals, the size and shapes and makeups of various parts of their bodies. Here's another example. This is in Berlin. So very extensive preserved specimens. And so some of the things I've been talking about will get us thinking about lots of the issues that are at stake here between, the normal and the pathological, and defining what is the normal, and then thinking about how race and gender fit in with these classifications, and thinking about the birth of these collections sort of coincided with the birth of certain disciplines like criminology, comparative anthropology, psychology and psychiatry. And if you're interested further in these issues and these really important questions that are raised by these collections, then one of the places I would send you to look, first of all, Foucault for sure. Michel Foucault's written extensively on the birth of the clinic and in little bits of Discipline and Punish, little bits of the history of sexuality, and definitely in The Order of Things, he talks about how a lot of this compulsion to collect and to categorize and to name things and to place them in certain comparative brackets or categories is really this compulsion to build knowledge in the 18th and 19th centuries, in which we are still living the legacy and still part of. And one of the texts also of interest, and that's Foucault's, written by Foucault's supervisor, Canguilhem. The book is called The Normal and the Pathological by Georges Canguilhem, and it's Canguilhem, I think. He talks about how the normal is defined against the pathological, and how part of this was this whole massive enterprise to get people to live in productive, laboring, reproductive, heteronormative bodies. And Paul Youngquist, too, is somebody who's written on this, and he says that normal and pathological bodies are functionally equivalent, making health a condition that is not just normal, but normative. In other words, it is shaping the idea, defining the idea of normal, and shaping your body into fitting into that category. And Youngquist picks up from Foucault's idea of the proper body and of the body that is disciplined in modern society. And he says that a significant role of medical science historically has been to build the proper body. And you build the proper body from what Foucault calls the docile body, the one that takes the imprint of society, and that is constructed and shaped to fit certain normative models. So medicine has built this proper body from docile bodies, and life does not in and of itself confer humanity on a human organism. That distinction comes through its ability to participate in civil society. And so what Youngquist is getting at here is that this building of the proper body is presented to us as part of, what is natural, what is biological, but is actually really very much a part of culture and society and politics. And you can't distinguish or differentiate between the forming of that body and the forming of the societies in which we live. Okay, and so some of these collections reflect that. Here's just some examples. The collecting of skulls, which happened all over the world and all at different times, but really was popular at the end of the 18th century and 19th centuries. In particular, here's some photos of collected skulls of fetuses. These are skulls from all over the world. One of the oops, hang on, let me skip ahead a little bit. Here's a sort of clearer example of these collections that I'm talking about. This one in particular is at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, and all these labels, this is again one men's collection, and all these labels tell you the age and gender, the sex of the skull and where it's from in the world. And as you can see by just the way they're displayed, which is also how they would have been displayed, side by side by side, so that you can make comparisons between them, so that you can see, the bigger skull, you can see the shape of the skull, you can compare the, nasal cavities between them, all of that sort of thing. And just to go back here, and not just the skull, of course, the skeletons. This one's in London. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, I've got this. Isn't that interesting? Never mind. There's I thought this was the one in London, which has, in London, there's a skeleton from a chap who was called the Irish Giant next to a dwarf who was called the Italian dwarf, who was a female and an opera singer in the 19th century, and there compares. But that will show you how this was really part of 19th century culture, because this one, which is doing a very similar thing, is also at the Mutter Museum, and this is the average, and then the two pathological, the giant and the dwarf. Okay. So there's something here when we talk about normality and this pressure on bodies, the shaping them to be normative, and this normative compulsion of medicine and how it plays out in medical museums and pathological museums. There's this whole element of morality, and in fact a lot of these museums historically really defended what they were doing, showing bodies, by saying it was a moral enterprise. And I should say at this point, and here's an example, that although the museums we're looking at so far look pretty scientific and pretty sort of official, there were alongside them, or at times part of this Victorian freak show, or this early 20th century freak shows, and indeed all through 20th century there were freak shows that showed unusual or exceptional bodies or disabled bodies. And in the past, in the 19th century, 20th century, a lot of these freak shows or pathological museums that were more popular, and that people would just go, they'd pay and go and see all of these wonders and these collections and body parts and wax models. A lot of them, had this sort of, they were obviously about the voyeur who wants to look, but they are also about sort of promoting this morality, or at least on the surface. And so, for instance, this example from Germany, they would show legs with syphilis as a kind of warning against sex outside of marriage or sex with prostitutes. Here's another example of a female with syphilis on the face, a wax model. This one's from the Netherlands. And in Britain, this is an example of, there were touring pathological museums and shows. And so this is an example for a show in Huddersfield that would show an anatomical Venus, the celebrated Florentine anatomical Venus, and as it says here, together with numerous smaller models of special interest to ladies, showing the marvelous mechanism of the human body. And a lot of this was also, women would typically go in on a different day. Yes, it says here, ladies admitted every Monday and Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Saturday for the gentlemen. And this is promoted as something that is healthy and good to do and is morally upstanding. And if you would understand your body better, then you would treat it better and you would live healthier lives. Lectures will be illustrative of the sources of health and disease, etc. Okay, now there are some darker overtones to a lot of these shows. For example, this anatomical Venus, sometimes they were like virtual vivisection, because and often they would admit as such, because the body would be open and they had various mechanisms, so it looked like the body was breathing and the blood was moving through glass veins, and so it was as if you would cut open a living woman and you were looking at this vivisected woman in intense pain, and she was pregnant, and then would show the blood moving to the fetus. Another example of sort of problematic parts or elements to these shows is that they would show these kind of so monstrous or freak bodies, as they were called, which we wouldn't say so much anymore, hopefully. But this is really part of that sort of othering of people who are different than or from somewhere else, or who had exceptional bodies. So if you look at this one, the Satyr, or Real Wild Men of the Woods, it may be justly asserted that this animal is of a different species from any creature ever seen in Europe, and seems to be the link between the rational, i.e. Europeans, and brute creation. It was brought from the deserts of Abyssinia and Ethiopia, etc., etc. This astonishing creature, when he stands erect, is near 5 feet high, and in many respects is a striking resemblance of the human species. Striking resemblance, but not quite. And you can go on and read about this curiosity. And here's another example. This is Crow, and you know, this is in the time of Darwin, and you can see how Darwin's theories are sort of really twisted and used to promote this showing of this body. So there's a postcard of Crow, and here is the advertisement to come and see her. And she's called the missing link. She's a living proof of Darwin's theory of the descent of man, the wonder of wonders. The usual argument against the Darwinian theory, i.e. that we descended from apes, is that man and monkey, the usual argument against the Darwinian theory that man and monkey had a common origin has always been that there's no animal in between. So there's no one in the transmission state between monkey and man. So, you know, where are the creatures in between? How can we possibly be descended? Well, Crow is the evidence, a perfect specimen of the step between man and monkey, discovered in Laos by that distinguished traveller Karl Bach, will be on exhibition in the new lecture room. All should see her. And there you go. Okay, and I'm just showing you these out of interest, just to show you how they were advertised, the kinds of places they were, the kinds of things they had, and yeah, oh yeah, and this one's in America, in New York City, so that just to give you a sense of how popular they were, you know, farther afield. And here's a few more. Here we've got the Florentine Venus and the Greek Venus anatomical figures, embryology, obstetrical operations, a cesarean operation, man's nervous system, and then again the freak show aspect of this, the Aztec Lilliputians. Okay. So the question is where to now? And I was going to stop, I've gone slightly over time, but instead I'll just continue on with this part of the lecture. So one of the things to think about is, yeah, what is the legacy of all this? So where have we drawn the lines now? So we have proper medical museums, and in fact some of them you cannot go into unless you are a medical student, so there isn't that voyeuristic aspect to them anymore in the way they were, and the separation between, you know, science and the arts is, as you know, much stronger, even though we're trying to fuse those back together in all kinds of ways. Also the line between entertainment and science is really much stronger. The boundaries are much clearer. However, there are some challenges to the idea that there are such divisions, and there are also some challenges about where we might go now in light of the fact that we have, you know, all kinds of important work being done on gender and on sexuality and on disability and difference and the way we conceive of each other and the way we form ideas about identity based upon bodies. So let me give you a few case studies that will get you thinking about where we are now. So one is, you know, what is this sort of culture? What's happened to this culture of collecting? So one of the figures of real interest in terms of pathology and display, exhibition, and the line between entertainment and medicine is, as John Treves, sorry, I went to click my, never mind, I accidentally clicked stop, and I dare not resume at the end of that in case I erased that second lecture. So there is a third little lecture. So just picking up from what we were saying, the example of the Elephant Man is precisely something that we should think about when we are considering where we are now. So the Elephant Man, Joseph Merrick, or John Merrick, who's known as both, was, most people would say, exploited in some way by the doctor who took him in and treated him, Treves, who also took photographs of him and also displayed him and also wrote medical articles about him. Now, obviously, things are not so cut and dried where you say, oh, yes, he really exploited him, or, Treves is a terrible guy. As is typical, good intentions were there. It's hard to say what would have become of Merrick had Treves not stepped in. He did take him from being exhibited in a freak show. You could say, yeah, but he was exhibited in a different kind of way, just to a different kind of audience. However, he was medically treated, and there is also a question about, the study of Merrick's body. If the study of his body is going to help other people who suffer with the condition that he suffered from, then isn't that a good thing, you might say. But then you might say, what about the dignity that each body has a right to? The dignity that each person is owed in life and in death. So this is a figure that lived in the end of the 19th century, but we still have his body at Queen Mary University, and we have a collection there of his belongings, and you can see a scientist in the image here studying part of Merrick's skeleton. Let's move forward, and here's things on display. The hat and the sort of veil, if you put it that way, that Merrick wore to sort of hide his appearance, and then the model of a cathedral that Merrick, who was very sensitive and skilled, intelligent individual, that he built. And the other really, I guess, a kind of bigger example to think about is Gunther von Hagen's Body World. I don't know how many of you will have gone to see one of these shows, but just briefly, they have been around since the 80s, and these shows are big and huge and expensive, and they tour the world. They've been in any numbers of cities all over the world for the last 30, 40 years. And what these are, if you don't know, is that Gunther von Hagen's developed a process of preserving a real dead body. It's called plastination. So these bodies that you see here were real living bodies, and they were preserved with plastination, or I should say the top two in particular. And one, we have what is, you could say, is an anatomical Venus, not so unlike the 18th century or 19th century ones for our time. And again, Gunther, it's like a kind of return to the past, because Gunther von Hagen uses aesthetics. In his shows, he has quotes from Shakespeare and art and photography in his shows, and he poses his plastinates in aesthetic poses, and there's also a whole kind of moral overtone. There's like the smoking man, he'll show lungs that are smokers' lungs, the ones that are clean pink lungs from someone who doesn't smoke, and I've seen shows where he has photographs of families, what they eat, and comparing them, so less healthy in America and more healthy in, you know, Thailand or something like that. And then there's the Visible Human Project, which is the slicing of, you can go online and see the Visible Human Project. That's not at a museum, but it is getting us to, it's, you know, it's a kind of virtual space, a virtual museum of sorts, to look at real bodies that have been, you know, preserved, frozen, and then really thinly sliced, so that we can see all the we can visualize and we can see the inside of the body, which is made transparent to our eyes. So this raises all kinds of issues, which you will think of on your own. But I'm just going to throw out some key words that should get you thinking about the issues around the display of the body, and particularly the internal body, in medical museums and galleries. So it's, you know, it's one way to exhibit, demonstrate, and motivate people to think about the relationship between mind and body. And often these are attempts to read the body. If you think about those pieces of criminal, tattoos from the skin of criminals, these are, yeah, and think about what's involved with reading the body and misreading the body. And this is very much about the authority of the visual, and there's all kinds of ways of looking that are problematic, that join together violence and desire. And what of human curiosity and the legacies of human curiosity? And what about our curiosity now? Has it changed? In what ways? And yeah, there's a lot of scapegoating, pointing the finger at certain causes or origins of pathology. There's exploitations of people's bodies, of people who cannot protest. There's the culture of collecting and categorization that you should think about. Experimentation. And this is a legacy of enlightenment. What are the not so enlightened parts? What are the darker parts of this move to knowledge, this move to make transparent, this move to see the body? And is it progressive? What parts of it are not? And what of the ethics? What about human dignity? And what about the ways deviance or the abnormal or the pathological is exhibited? How, in what, is that problematic? And if so, in what ways? And how should we exhibit this, if at all? And I'm going to leave it there. Now you really got a lot of lecturing. Okay, thanks again for bearing with me, and apologies for the lateness of these. I hope you get something out of them. Thank you.